We all think nothing these days about borrowing iPhone or iPad cables and using them with our devices. And we take a view that as long as we're not plugging it into something we don't know about, then clearly there's no threat. What happens if the threat is of the cable itself? What happens if the cable is attacking your device?
OMG cable thing is, from a technical perspective and from a security nerd perspective, really, really fascinating stuff. What this guy's managed to do to get all of this into a cable, and in effect it is, in essence, a mini computer stuck in the end of an Apple cable, is incredible.
It feels a bit like this is the kind of the USB that we might get free at, a conference or something like that, or, at a hotel where a conference might be held.
OMG Cables has garnered more publicity for the kind of the attack vector of a cable than anyone else. First turned up at DEF CON a couple of years ago and has been in the headlines lots since. Anyway, we talked to my group for STC just to get his view in terms of where the cable came from and just exactly how big a threat it represents.
So yeah, the background on the cable itself is, at the time, I just wanted to figure out if I could do it. Like, can I shrink something down small enough that it'll fit in a cable, not just any cable, but like, the really hard to get ones in terms of the physical size, like the smallest, weanest one.
The two really clever things that you've done and, that have got attention. The first one is you have created a near perfect replica of an Apple product. That's what got attention with the Lightning cable, which is really hard because it's, small and hard to play with. And the other thing for people to understand is this is a self-contained cable, right? It doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be plugged into something else that is attacking the device. The cable itself is the attack.
I've got like an entire computer embedded inside the cable. It has a wireless access point. It's got a whole bunch going on, and there's a bunch of storage. So yeah, you connect wirelessly. It can create an access point, or you can have it connect to a network. Anyway, you use a web browser to control every aspect of the cable. So you don't even need an app to interface with. And what do you do there? So DuckyScript. DuckyScript was kind of pioneered, invented by Hack5 for doing keystroke injection based attacks. So it makes it really easy to type up script that, I should probably explain what keystroke injection is. So basically, Hack5 pioneered this. You plug in a thumb drive, it acts like a keyboard, and it types really fast. So whatever you can do with a keyboard, you can do, with DuckyScript, right? So we basically took that concept and extended it, stuck it inside of a cable, added a wireless interface. That way, so in terms of like red team stuff, red team is where you are part of a sanctioned exercise of attacking a company, right? So in a scenario like that, things change rapidly. So if you've got a situation where you've got this cable in play, and then you realize you need to modify the script or the payload, whatever it is, well, that's really hard to do unless you've got that wireless interface. So that wireless interface allows you to dynamically change the payload on the fly without having to touch the cable, which was, and that's something I really wanted at the time.
So clearly you can do keystroke injection, but you also can do key logging. So
yeah,
if you were
later.
To attack a device, then you could log the keys to access the device, and then once the device is unlocked, then you can, in essence, inject keystrokes into the device. So this is how you do more than just intercept what's being typed into that device, right?
Exactly. So that was added later. That was like another thing. It's like, okay, we got all these people coming to help. I'm like, I knew technically it was possible to do key logging with this setup.
You take a kind of a proper offensive cyber approach to this, and some of the other things that I know you've talked about, so geofencing, so the cable behaves differently in different places, and also the kind of self-destruct. So
yeah, right.
If that cable ends up in the wrong hands, you can automate a process whereby it just becomes a dumb cable, right? And this is clever stuff.
Exactly. It's like stuff I saw. I'm like, wait a second. Seeing how the process works internally at companies, it's like legal sometimes is going to have an issue with. So there's like salting a parking lot, like you saw in like Mr. Robot and stuff, where they just salt a bunch of USB drives in the parking lot and hope that an employee will pick one up and bring it in. But you don't know, you can't control where those thumb drives go. Now, a real attacker, not obeying laws, doesn't care about that. But you know, when it's a sanctioned exercise, you want some control. I'm like, wait a second, we could put that check in there. Like, it can only run if it's, you know, within scope of the buildings, or, you know, it's the building's wireless network. Perfect. So yeah, especially if you're using proprietary malware. So that's another thing. It's like, sometimes you'll use some stuff that attacks company that you don't want leaking out, right?
And I know there's been talk about, you know, potentially even putting malware into the cable itself. So clearly there's almost like a responsibility side to who's getting hold of these cables and what they can do with them. What you're saying is that there's a responsibility thing here. So there's only a limited set of functionality that you'll just, you know, openly sell.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, just the idea of the, you know, the Type-C mobile attack pathway being, you know, demo is in the fact that the cable in that mode will not charge or sync the phone. So, you know, you've got a limited ability to kind of abuse that without the target knowing, right? So it's better for training, demos and stuff like that, which is actually a huge amount of people. I've heard so many companies saying that this cable is one of the best things they have in their arsenal to teach people, have it click in their head. And it's just like kind of this visceral nature of this physical thing that's super like, wait, the cable attacks what? I mean, even the USB-A spec never accounted for an active cable. It was always supposed to be a passive device. So yeah, it's been valuable there as well.
So if you kind of put your cables to one side and just think about the lesson learned here for people out there, and I guess a lot of the people reading it will, you know, not think about using other cables because they're at home or in the office, but we all travel, you go to airports, you go to hotels, there are cables lying around. These cables look like everyone else's, so it's easy to substitute. I guess what it shows you is the art of the possible. You can actually put the electronics into an actual cable. And if that was in the wrong hands, so if you were, you know, in a trade delegation or you work in government service, and you're overseas in a hotel, in a, you know, an adversarial country, these are the genuine risks that you run that you'd never ever think about.
Yeah, exactly. And it's worth mentioning that this isn't the type of threat the average person's going to encounter. It's not like somebody's going to buy a bunch of these and somehow put them, you know, into a retail store. So, I mean, it's totally possible. It's just doesn't make any sense because there's so many easier pathways to go after somebody. Like, you know, phishing still works phenomenally, and that's free, right? Like that, until all of those things get solved, it's not going to be something you experience. Now, when you have a much more hardened security posture where it's actually harder to pull that off, that's when, yeah, okay, we got a, you know, a high value target. We need to go after this individual because, you know, phishing or other pathways aren't going to work. Yeah.
Clearly, the core electronics in the wrong hands, if in the hands of an overseas government that is in, you know, compromising a hotel, you know, government service or trade delegation type gas, they could use a cable with the same kind of setup to plant malware on a device, to log what that device is doing. They could leave these stuff lying around. They could hand them out with, you know, little logos on it, the way we all get free kit.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of ways to get that in. There is historical precedent. That's something that a lot of people don't know, is these types of cables, like just malicious cables in general, have existed for over a decade. Like, you know, there is evidence of it inside of what the NSA was doing with the Snowden leaks. I think they go back to like 2008 when there was, you know, I think it was $1 million for 20 of these cables, really expensive. They do, you know, different things, but it's proof that this has existed. It's been in play. It's kind of been, you know, clandestine and not really known. So this just kind of opens the doors and allows other people to kind of security model around it and just think through the scenarios.
And I think that's the key point. I think people reading about your cables are not the threat here. What we're not saying is you can go onto Hack5, buy a bunch of cables and get attacked. What we're saying is this is the art of the possible, right? So, you know, clearly if you're out in Asia and your computer or your mobile device is compromised, it's not going to be with one of your cables, but it shows you what you can do with a cable. And that cable will have come out of a government lab. It will be an offensive cyber tool that will have been sanctioned for use. That's what we're trying to tell people here is don't use cables that you don't know where they came from, right?
Yep. And it's worth mentioning that, you know, these entities that have been doing it's because they're funded, right? And if you just look at the news of the last month, right, like who's gaining huge amounts of money right now through ransomware, right? And it's just snowballing. They're taking, you know, R&D, putting it back in. Where does that go? I don't know, but clearly the funding pathways are changing.
But you have to look at the attack surface, the threat surface. The risk to you and me, probably fairly small, but that doesn't mean that you can just dismiss it out of hand.
This could be targeted at anybody within a business who might manage anything or deal with any data that might be useful to governments, which is actually pretty wide now, isn't it?
And so we're talking about government, we're talking about commercial espionage, we're talking about threats that exist. This isn't make-believe. Nobody's going to go out and buy a bunch of cables and try and use them to stalk their partner. That's just not going to happen. This is very specific threats, but one that we can't ignore.
The interesting thing for me is that, and particularly as the ransomware threat escalates, it's the soft underbelly, it's the easy access points into big enterprises. Because it's why we've seen things like LinkedIn attacks on HR to try and just get some enterprise credentials, and we've seen cyber reports over the last couple of years of how sophisticated cyber adversaries, whether government sponsored or not, have been in mapping large organizations. They don't necessarily start with the people they're targeting. They get in somewhere. And if you can steal enterprise credentials with something like this, you may not consider yourself to be a threat. The organization you work for, that might be a threat.
Of course, you've got to remember that while the people behind the IMG cable are actually good guys, the bad guys are looking at this as well, and will no doubt have already started to implement similar things. Those bad guys could be government level. We could be talking about state-sponsored attackers already using this, and we wouldn't know about it.